Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and another video in my series where I do a little reading of one of my poems, followed by a second video, which is this one, where I talk a little bit about it. That might be background inspiration, my own perspective and thoughts on it. It might be things to do with technique and style. I might give you some tips on that. It might be digressions on art and poetry in general. Um, it might be, I don't know, just random philosophical things I just happen to think about as I am talking, because, and this is a warning to those of you who do not know my channel, I do digress a lot, and that is, of course, also because I don't script. So this is, by definition, my channel is unscripted, and usually my videos are also uncut. The only thing I usually cut is phone calls, somebody coming at the door, or some really bad sneezing and coughing. Otherwise, I usually leave my videos unedited, with all the beautiful flaws they might contain. So, then there might also be a third video, which is a musical piece using the text of the poem as lyrics. I have yet to decide whether that is going to be the case for today's video, as I haven't made something yet. But if I make something that I'm happy with, that might also be part of this 3-video set. Otherwise, it's going to be a 2-video set. Now, another thing that I will habitually add to these videos, I have decided, is I will also use this particular format for my updates. When it comes to publishing poetry, it seems apt to do it in these videos. Those of you who are interested in my poetry collections would also most likely be watching these videos. That's the theory, anyway. In these days, the last few months, my main creative project has been to revise, update, correct, extend, otherwise change my and improve my old poems, and many of which have been published before in 3 poetry collections that I published in 2001 and 2004, but no longer available to buy, the old ones, since 2014, because in 2014 I started making some changes to poems I'd already published, and I decided I had to actually go through more of them, and so I didn't want the old versions to be available anymore, and so I pulled my books from the market. And I also didn't finish the job 10 years ago, but today, not today, but these days, I am very close to being finished with the first part of the job, which is to have gone through pretty much all the poems that were in those 3 first poetry collections, and making the alterations that I feel should be made now, which is a little bit strange because I am actually making changes now, in many cases 30 years after the poems were originally made. And that means, of course, that I see my life and what I wrote about in a completely different perspective. But I think the combination of the old perspective with the new perspective is something that adds to it, in my opinion. But also, I do keep some poems entirely as they were originally written. With, of course, the risk that they might seem a little bit juvenile and naive, but I still feel like they're part of my personal history, like something I'd look at in a box of memorabilia from my earlier early part of my life, and say that, oh yeah, I used to be so so different in those days. So I think it helps to have the experiences that in many cases inspired my poems at such a distance that I can view them in a new light and also make what I think in most cases would be improvements. Now, some people might think it's a bit of sacrilege to go and change poems that have already been published, but as far as I'm concerned, my poems are works in progress until the day I die, basically. So as long as I'm alive, I reserve the right to change anything that I've written before, and nobody else can really say anything about it. Yeah, so that's the end of that. So I'm not republishing my old poems in the sense I think I'd rather refer to it as replacing them. So I had 3 poetry collections: Eternal Moments, The Secret Box, and The Wind Is All Quiet, and those 3 will be replaced by 1994. That's the first one. That's just my proof copy from Amazon. Then there is 3 Words and Breaths of Time. Those 3 will be entirely new collections. The selection is going to be different. Even many of the poems that were in those earlier ones will have been changed. And the publication is right around the corner as I'm making this video. They are technically available to buy, but I'm not going to recommend anyone buying them just yet as of this very moment. Of course, by the time you watch this video, it might be a time to buy them, but at the moment I am still wanting to check just one or few little things to see if I'm happy with them. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist when it comes to these things, and I want to see that it looks the way I want them to. Anyway, so that's also going to be part of these videos, and I think I pretty much told you what I wanted to say about the update there in the introduction to the fact that there wouldn't be updates on my poetry publication project. Yeah, good alliteration there. Today's poem that I wanted to talk a little bit about is one called I Stare Into the Sun, and a few reasons why I chose this particular one. The first one is that it's nice and short. The second one is that it's one that springs very easily to my mind. Maybe when I go out in the sun and it's a bright sunny day today, it's one of those that just pop into my mind when I'm feeling the bright sun on my eyes and I'm thinking, oh, I stare into the sun, and it's too late. So it's and of course I know it by heart because it is really short. Another thing that actually occurred to me earlier today before I made this video, or as I was about to start making this video, is that it's quite possible that a significant part of the potential demographic of viewership for this kind of video, where I talk about poetry, is going to be one of people that either want to write poetry or that write poetry, but they may not be entirely sure how to go about it, or whether they're doing it right, or whether they want to improve their style, or they want to do something different, and they want different perspectives, etc., etc. And for those, I also wanted to show that a short poem can be a good thing, because one thing that people might be insecure about might be the length of their poems. They're thinking that, oh, just one verse, that's not enough, really, is it? But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I'm not going to explain the details of it just yet, but the minimum length of a poem is 1 word. You can have a poem that is just 1 word, and it will work perfectly fine as a poem. I'm going to get back to that some other video, because that has to do with how poetry actually works, what makes a poem a poem, and what makes art art. So it's to do with those kinds of things. It's a matter of aesthetic philosophy. I'm gonna get into that in other videos. If I try to say something about it in this video, I'm probably going to digress and also going to dig myself into a slight sort of muddle of not being able to express things as well as I want to, or in a slightly unstructured way. I don't want that. So it's one of those things I may actually want to script or semi-script, or at least structure out in some kind of bullet list. So I make sure that I tell you the right things in the right order, and make sure that I don't explain it in a way that isn't understandable. So the poem can be one word long, and also the only rule you have to follow when you write poetry is your own rules that you put on yourself as constraints to how you want to write them. So that's the only rule that you need to follow, because there are technically no rules for art. I suppose you could say, oh, the rule of poetry is it has to be words that make up a poem. But yeah, that's just the medium, as it were, not the rule for actually using the medium. So yeah, so you as the artist, you create your own constraints as a means of displaying constraints, and therefore as a means of creating an expression that can be interpreted in different ways by displaying its own constraints. I'll explain that in some other video. Okay, so I Stare into the Sun, an example of a short poem that I believe, my personal opinion is that if I had made it longer or added to it, it would have reduced its potential for meaning. And I think also that's something I became aware of when I was revising my poems, because many of the poems that I revised now over the last few months, I have added new stanzas to. Some of them started out as 1 or 2 stanzas and ended up as 5 or 6. So that's quite a big addition to what was there before. But in those cases, I feel that the additions have added to it rather than detracted from it. But sometimes you have an expression that is exactly what you want in as short and succinct a way as you might want to do it, and then you feel that adding something might subtract from it. So A Stare into the Sun is one of those for me, and so I want to keep it the way it is. I don't want to add anything to it. I don't want to remove anything from it. So for you budding poets out there, short poems, perfectly fine. Believe what you do and make your own rules and be confident about them. So yeah, so what to say about this poem? First, a little bit of background in this case. So this is one of those that I'm quite sure I remember the context in which it was written. So I was working on a novel in the late 90s, which never became anything because I don't think my literary sensibilities are suited to writing novels, I think. And I did actually send off a copy to a publisher, and the editor that looked at it, he actually said exactly the same thing I'm going to tell you now. He said that he thought that I would be more suited to writing poetry than novels, which I believe is actually the case. I think that the thing about novels is they really have to be character driven in order to work. You need character development, you need character arcs, you need character interaction, things like that. A poem, on the other hand, is very often it's a glimpse of something. It's not an arc usually. There are exceptions, of course, but usually it's a glimpse of something. And this little glimpse tells you something. It might imply a story that comes before or after, but it's just a little moment of it that you can interpret in different ways for what happened before and what happened after. To whatever extent it's actually narrative in the first place. Sometimes poems don't have any narratives, they don't have any actions, they just moods, impressions. So just like art can be just a mood or an impression rather than something that is representative. of something else. So I think that I'm better suited for that because, and I do have lots of stuff from the manuscript of that novel. There are bits that I can take out and use as poems, or that I can use as short stories or short fiction or things like that, microfiction, whatever you call it. So I'm going to dissect it at some point and create it into something else. And one of the sections in that novel that I quite like, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about that now. So there's the protagonist, the first person singular. He has written a really long letter to someone from his life that he's been thinking about so much that the kind of person that she has turned into for him is someone who definitely does not exist. So he has made someone into his own image. In his own mind, he has created an own image of someone from writing about her to the point where it's a completely different person. And which is, I think, is something that I certainly can relate to. I've done that before. And this letter, of course, he decides that he's not going to give it to the recipient of it. He's going to throw it over a cliff. And the cliff he has chosen for this particular occasion is Santorini. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the island of Santorini. Santorini is an island that used to be a volcano, a nice conical volcano, as you can imagine. But of course, at one point it exploded. And so now you have a big sort of, not quite a lagoon, but you have a big round bay where the caldera used to be of the volcano, and you have islands that sort of create a little crescent shape with very sharp cliffs down towards what used to be the caldera of the cauldron of the volcano. Caldera just means cauldron in Spanish, really, but caldera of the volcano. So, so he's standing at the top of this cliff, and he throws this big sheaf of papers off and see them flying off like shining seagulls in the sunlight, a very bright, strong sunlight. And it's almost like he's letting part of his soul go, irretrievably, of course, by throwing these papers off. And he then lies down on the ground, and he just stares into the sun. And so in many ways, this particular section of the book, you sort of get the impression you're not sure whether he's considering just throwing himself off the cliff, whether he believes that he did. It's a bit ambiguous, or even whether he actually pushed someone else off as well. So it's quite an interesting section, I think, that I will make into a short story one day. In any case, so he lies down on the ground and he stares into the sun, and he goes blind. Well, at least this is how he recounts the story. It's also a part of the story that's I think is very an unreliable narrator, and you're not sure exactly what's going on. But that's beside the point. So, and those particular words of this poem came to me when I was writing this particular novel, which is written in Norwegian. So, of course, the words in English, I did actually first write it into the novel in English. I stare into the sun and it's too late. My eyes go blind, my tears evaporate, as something that just goes through his mind as he is lying there staring into the sun, and things just get darker instead of brighter. But of course, as I was changing the novel, I did actually change the words into Norwegian, although it actually means something different in Norwegian because I'm keeping the poetry of it, or the poeticness of it, but it needed a change of words. That's a different story. I'm not going to go into the Norwegian version of it at the moment. So that's where it's from. That's the background. That's what prompted me to write this particular poem, is actually my failed attempt at a novel, which doesn't dishearten me really. Learned a lot from it, and of course bits of it are really good. So but what does it mean to me? To me, this poem has certain connotations to some adages and also some mythological stories. And first of all, staring into the sun. That is a really stupid thing to do. So you could think of it as a metaphor for doing something that you know you shouldn't do, and if you do it, you will suffer the consequences. So, and to me, that reminds me of the story of Icarus from Greek mythology, where I can't remember exactly what prompted the making of the wings in the first place, but you have Daedalus and Icarus, father and son, who are trying to escape from somewhere. I think they're trapped, they are imprisoned somewhere on an island, and Daedalus, of course, who is also famous for being the clever artificer who created the labyrinth on Crete, the labyrinth of King Minos, and of course that's the one where they had the famous Minotaur, the Minotaur. I like to say actually Minotaur in Greek mythology, in the Minoan civilization. He is the one who actually made the labyrinth, is Daedalus, and he has the clever idea of making wings with wax and feathers. So he creates wings for himself, he creates wings for his son Icarus, and he tells his son, do not fly too close to the water because your wings will get wet and you will fall in. Do not fly too close to the sun because your wings will melt and you will fall into the sea. Icarus, he is young, he's impulsive, he's passionate, he's got all those foibles of youth, all those things that I see when I'm actually reading my own poetry. It reminds me that I used to have certain ideas that I actually can see some of myself in the story of Icarus sometimes, in how that I sometimes would pursue something hopeless, thinking that my passion for the pursuit would be enough to make it successful. Yeah, that's something that in hindsight seems quite stupid, but there you go, the impulsivity and foolishness of youth. One can do such things. And hopefully one learns from it. Now, in the case of Icarus, of course, he started flying and he thought the sun was so beautiful and tempting that he wanted to fly towards it. And he his wings melted and he fell into the sea. Daedalus, of course, he managed to get across and survive and escape because he just flew at exactly the right height. Very sensible. Of course, the point of this story is that one shouldn't really be chasing the foolish impulsivity so much and passion, not when you know that it will lead to your own destruction. But people still do, of course. And this is the same kind of thing. So if you stare into the sun, you know it will lead to your own destruction or to the destruction of your eyes. You know you will go blind. There's absolutely no secrets to the fact that if you stare into the sun, you will go blind. But I wanted to add something that wasn't really part of the Icarian myth, as it were, because Icarus, of course, he dies. He goes too close to the flame, his wings melts, he dies. Moth to the flame, I suppose, is another metaphor for this kind of thing. But I wanted to imply that perhaps sometimes you learn from your mistakes, that it can be, in a way, cathartic to have experienced your mistake as long as you survive it. So this is another adage, of course, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So I'm actually put that in where if you stare into the sun, what else happens? If you are crying when you stare into the sun, maybe your tears would evaporate, so they would actually disappear. And I was thinking metaphorically, of course, that if you stare into the sun, you're doing something foolish, you're pursuing the hopeless. It might be, for instance, unrequited love. It might be being hopelessly in love with someone you know will never be in love with you, no matter how much you try. And you are going to cause yourself sorrow and pain and all those kinds of things. But by doing so and then pushing through it, you might get to the point where you learn not to do it again, one would hope. And also, it might actually lead you to an even better place eventually as well. So your tears evaporate. You stop crying. You can't cry anymore because your tears are gone. And you might be blind, but in a way you have learned to see in a new way. So when I'm reading this poem myself, I see all of these things. I'm thinking about Icarus. I'm thinking about learning from mistakes. I'm thinking about following passions to when you know that it's going to destroy you. But I like that little bit of hope in there as well. It's not all destructive. It's not all bad. It's not all black or white. And this reminds me for a moment about there's a Norwegian poet, I can't remember which one actually, who wrote a poem based on the myth of Sisyphus. He is the one who rolls the boulder up the hill. And when it gets to the top, the boulder just rolls off the other side and rolls down again. And so he has to go down and start over again. But there is one version of this story, I think it's a Norwegian poet that wrote this, where every time the boulder rolled down again, it broke the neck of a lizard. I think something like that it says. So the idea is that something has changed. Every time you do it, it's almost futile, but not quite. And although it seems quite final that you stare into the sun and you go blind, of course, yeah, it seems quite final. It just doesn't have to be, I suppose. It depends when you actually end up closing your eyes again, and it is possible to heal from it, but it will take a while. It does take a while, I'm sure. I wouldn't do it. I'd not recommend it. Doesn't matter how much you're crying. Do not stare into the sun. So for me, that's what this poem is about. It's about chasing the impossible, destructive, following your destructive passions, knowing they will destroy you, and yet getting through them and finding something positive in it as you get past them. And as you can see, getting back to my earlier point, I don't think that there's any way that adding anything to this poem could have done anything but detract from that, what I consider quite a richness of potential meaning from what is otherwise a very short poem. So when I was revising my poems and I looked at it and I was sort of thinking what could come next, and I just realized that there's absolutely no way I could add anything to it. It just has to be like that. So that is the story of I Stare Into the Sun. I'm just wondering if there's anything else I want to add to that now. I can't think of anything. So yeah, just to, since I've done that bit, now I'm going to talk a little bit about my poetry republishing project. So what I have chosen to do, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I've chosen to lay these out now. So when I read poetry collections, there are a few things that can annoy me sometimes. And one thing that annoys me is if a stanza goes across pages. I like whole stanzas should always be on the same page so you can tell where the stanzas go. So for instance, this one here, so you got three stanzas on, three stanzas here and you got two stanzas there. Otherwise, it could have been a sort of a half stanza down here, maybe. Not a good thing. Another thing that I like, that I find a little bit sort of annoying when I'm reading as well, is if a new poem starts on the bottom of a page underneath another one. I don't like that. So for a proper poetry collection, I want new pages for poems, but I've taken it one step further in this one because I decided that I wanted only poems to start on the left side, so that when a short poem is there, there's going to be a blank page. And it may seem a little bit somehow as if I'm padding it out, but really, for my own sake, this is how I like it. I don't want any distractions from a poem. I want to be reading one poem at a time without being distracted by other texts. And so I thought I'd make a poetry collection the way that I would want a poetry collection to be. Another thing is that I've chosen a font size and spacing that I find very comfortable to read myself. I can read this very comfortably without reading glasses, something that becomes a concern once you get past a certain age, as I have. And so I've added a tiny bit of space in the left to right sort of kerning, and also the space between the lines is not double, but it's about 1.5 line spacing, roughly. Another thing I have added, I don't really like to have a sort of a front contents page in poetry collections. To me, that seems distracting. So the first thing you get to when you start shouldn't be a contents page. The first thing you get to when you start reading should really be the first poem. But also, I know that sometimes it's nice to be able to refer back to poems, so try to find a poem again. So I've done an index of titles and first lines, and I do them in one index because you do the titles in normal text and you can do the first lines in italics, for instance, like I've done here. So this one, the proof copy, is pretty close to how I want it, but what I have changed is margins. Let's see if you can see that now, that because of the binding as well, this text here on this side looks very close to the center, and this feels a bit cramped, and there's more space here. So what I'm trying to do now, what I have tried to do for my update, is I've moved the margin a little bit this way. For the outside text is going to be the smaller margin, and this one is moved a little bit further away from the spine. Something that I often see in books and that annoys me actually, when text gets too close to the middle, so it's harder to read and you have to really sort of scrunch up the book. And yeah, so I'm just waiting for my copies of this and also the other two collections to see if they all look fine, if there's any more corrections I want to make to any typos. If the index, actually there's still a risk that the index isn't perfectly alphabetical because I made it really quickly, and so I've not had a good chance to actually double and triple check that. I did find some few typos and errors when I looked over it before the last update of the text files, so I'm hoping that I've weeded out most of it now. But I do like to get things right. I'm not a big fan of typos, so one or two might be acceptable, but if I do find them, I will update the text, of course, and upload a new version to Amazon, because I want it to be just perfect. So, and when it comes to timelines now, as I said earlier, they are technically available to buy right now, but I'm not going to recommend buying it until I make another video telling you to go buying them. And that is because I would like to check them over one more time. So it's for your sake as well. I don't want anyone ending up with an inferior copy. So I'm going to get back to that, and also I might have some way for people to get signed copies, possibly. I haven't decided how to do that yet. Definitely anyone who's my friend on Facebook will be offered a signed copy, so I will get that sorted as well. So I'm quite sort of glad to see that sort of almost ready to go. And of course, another aspect of that is that, of course, now I will need to market them. And one of the ways I will market my books is to make these videos so that people will discover my poetry, and those who like poetry or who know someone who likes poetry might find something in here that perhaps appeals to them or they think might appeal to someone they know. So just to say something about style. So you will have noticed in the poems that I have chosen to read on my channel that most of my poems, you might infer from that, are lyrical. So I do like lyrical poetry, and by lyrical I mean it's poems that follow a regular rhythm and that has regular rhyme schemes, so patterns of rhyme throughout that are followed. And when a pattern of rhyme or a rhythm is deviated from, that in itself is, of course, an effect that is intended, something you can use as a poetic device to create a kind of tension or some breaking of a rhythm that is part of the expression. Of course, some of them just keep to their regular patterns. And some people think that's a sort of style of poetry that's inferior somehow to free verse, but I think that's absolute nonsense. And I'm going to tell you why. The reason is that people who don't know how to write poetry think that what makes something a poem is the rhymes. And so you get a lot of really bad poetry written by people who don't know how to write poetry that rhyme. But of course, poems that rhyme without using a regular rhythm and that otherwise don't use poetic language or imagery or metaphors or alliterations and other things that make it seem more poetic, actually just end up can sound quite childish and naive as well. And also if you have rhyming words that aren't really important words in the text as well, not always a bad thing, of course, it depends on the poem, but of course you always want to end on a strong rhyme, for instance. So these things have led some people to mistakenly believe, I think, that there is somehow something inferior in itself about poetry that is lyrical. But that is just because a lot of inferior poetry has been written in a style reminiscent of lyrical poetry, even though it's usually not that following the rules of lyricality particularly well. So well-written lyrical poetry is hard to write because not only do you have to express things the way you want them expressed in words, you are actually limiting your choice of words by deciding that there's going to be rhymes. So one of the things I do when I write poems, and I want it to rhyme, is I often have to keep rewriting, perhaps moving things around in a sentence or between different lines, trying to find an expression where I get good end rhymes. I can't just have any sort of rhymes that just happen to sort of go. It has to be good. And I think it's important to take the time to actually do it right. And I'm also very particular about rhythm. Something that a lot of people ignore because they don't even realize it's there. But regular rhythm is something that I think is quite essential to something that sounds good, because it's about how it sounds. Poetry should be read out loud. It shouldn't. Of course, there are exceptions. There are poems that are specifically written to be seen, visual poems. There's something about the way the words are put together that creates a visual aspect. It could create a shape, a form, a wave, different things. But generally speaking, the best way to experience poetry is by reading it out loud to yourself or hearing somebody else read it. I think that the process of reading it yourself out loud is probably by far the best, because you experience it in a different way, both the visually by looking at the words and hearing it at the same time, and you can try to find the expression of it that suits the poem the best, the rhythm that goes with the expression, with the content of it. And yeah, perhaps I'll say more about that in a future video as well. I don't want to make this video too long, and I do believe my voice is starting to go a little bit because I haven't been drinking enough, and it is a hot day. So just a few thoughts there on my current project of publishing my poetry collections, and I will make more videos about it when I am sure that they are the way I want them to be, which will be very soon, actually. Although I'm not sure if I'll be able to make the video right away because I'm actually going away for a few days on a little holiday. So it might be when I come back. So it might be in a few weeks' time. But there will be a video made, and I will talk about how to get the poetry collections and show them to you. And yeah, talk a little bit more about it. But those are my general viewpoints on it, the little things that I want from a poetry collection that I've tried to include in this one. Another thing, by the way, when I published my first poetry collections 20 years ago, I wasn't sure at all how to structure my poems. I mean, how to compile them, I should say, in what order. So what I usually did was I just did alphabetically. Now I've gone with an order that's a little bit more random because of the way I've let every single poem have its own spread. I've tried to sort of spread out a little bit so that you get not too many poems in a row that are just using a single page, for instance. But it's still it's a little bit random. This one is the first one is not that thematic, I would say. I believe that in especially in 3 words, the second one, I have some thematic groupings of poems where I have poems about war and poems about the sea or being a sailor, things like that. I think I've sort of managed to group them together a little bit so that there's some sort of coherence in them. In this one, there's a little bit of coherence that is it's more subtle because it's one that is for me to know and for no one else to find out. Because there are some groupings of poems from a specific time period to do with specific memories that otherwise might not look that related to others. That's just for me, really, just for my sake. I think they sort of fit together. But generally speaking, I would say it's semi-random. There's no. The thing is that my poems aren't meant to be read in a specific order. They're not meant to be. There are no poems in these 3 collections that are meant to be read together. Unlike, for example, and this is of course a common thing that people don't realize, that Shakespeare's sonnets. Shakespeare has some sonnets where you have 2 sonnets that follow on from each other directly, so that you have to actually read one and then you have to read the other. If you don't read the first one first, there is something in the second one you actually don't get because it's directly following on from the previous one. People don't realize that because normally you get them out of context. And most people would only read the highlights and they wouldn't read them in order from number 1 to number 154 or whatever it is, which you should do if you want to see them in proper context. So, but I have no poems that are intended to be read together one after the other, and they should all be seen as completely individual works. And I would also recommend when people read them to read them as individual works. So you read one at a time, reflect a little bit, and not rush to get to the next one. Is how I normally recommend reading poetry. Yeah, read it. I mean, they're quite short, so you can read it a few times and think about it, see how it feels, see how it tastes, as it were. Read it out loud, and see if how it sounds as well, and see if it offers you anything stimulating, whether it's because it makes you think, makes you feel, or whether it's just the language itself is something that appeals to you. I mean, there is no non-valid way of experiencing poetry. But I think one should, regardless of how one does it, one should at least um, try to experience it on its own merit, and see if it gives you something. It doesn't take too much effort, I think, with short poetry. And the thing is that I'm also not one for using language that is too complex. Now, there are a few words in my poetry collections that may not be the most common words. There is, of course, the occasional wordplay that uses potentially obscure meanings of common words. But most of the time it is pretty transparent on the surface of it what the words on the page actually means directly. And of course, then it's easier to get from the surface words down to what really matters, which of course is the subtext, which of course is entirely up to each and every one who reads to find out, because that is something you find in yourself. So I think I will call it a day now, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and that I hope you enjoyed my poetry reading, even though it's very short, and I hope you will enjoy the musical piece if there is one. And I hope I will also see you in my next video, where I will probably be a video where I talk about my poetry collections being actually ready, hopefully, fingers crossed. And until then, I hope you have a nice time. And was there anything else I wanted to say today? No, I don't think there was anything else. But if you want to support my channel and my creative work, you know what to do. And of course, soon I will also tell you that one of the things you can do to support my channel and my creative work is to buy my poetry collections, which I hope that some of you lovely viewers out there will consider doing. Even if you don't think poetry is your thing, if you want to support me, you can buy it, and of course you can give it to someone else if you think that's something they might appreciate. And feel free to buy it and just drop it in community bookshelves or charity shops or whatever, if you think somebody else might get some pleasure out of them. But by all means, if you do wish to support my channel, that is one of the best ways you can do it right now. Because, as you know, I'm not monetized on YouTube for various reasons. Well, the main reason being that they never sent me the PIN code, so I'm not able to register to get paid. They need an address verification, and their system is completely antiquated, and it doesn't work. So that's why I'm not monetized. But I think it's also a good thing, as I have expressed in videos before, that I now have a channel where you don't get annoying adverts. Instead, you get me annoying you entirely. So which is preferable is up to you to decide. Yeah, so any way you manage to support my channel is appreciated, whether it's Patreon, buying me a coffee, buying my music, my artwork, or my books. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in my next one, and goodbye for now. Bye bye. And I'm going to do my book fade out.